Thank you very much, Ken Corda, and thank you, Minister. And I appreciate your responses to the issues that I'm going to raise. Minister, obviously we're in the middle of a pandemic. Nobody needs to be reminded of that. It's a national crisis, and obviously the health concerns are foremost in our minds. But this is also hugely impacting on the ability of people to respond to this crisis in terms of how they live and where they live. And you are more likely to survive this crisis if you have a better quality of accommodation. And what this crisis has done is ripped out maybe the plaster that we have over many of our public services or the way we live in Ireland and exposed them. So our response in this period of time has to be far-reaching. It has to accept many of the failures of Irish society, and it has to maybe collectively pledge that we won't allow these things to re-emerge. And when we've been talking in this House forever about the state response to childcare or ending the one-tier or the two-tier health system and, God forbid, implementing a rent freeze, we were told that there's complications around these issues, they can't happen. And then a crisis comes and they can. I remember only too vividly raised voices in this House over the last time we had a major national crisis over the economic collapse, and the raised voices were about the behaviour of the banks and why we had to fund them and why we had to invest in them and why we had to bankroll them, if you like. And we couldn't do anything in this country without them. We had to have lending starting again, and they would learn their lesson, and they would change, and everything would be better. Now, of course, it just took the next crisis for many financial institutions to see their opportunity and to revert to type. And it is of no surprise to me and no surprise to many people that the banking ethic or lack thereof, the amorality within that system prevails, and they see an opportunity to screw somebody and they're going to screw them. And that, of course, is happening today. So I want to ask you, Minister, have your departments, knowing that they have absolute, or not absolute, but certainly a huge amount of knowledge of how housing works and the nature of housing in this country, the dynamics of housing, is your department working with the Department of Finance, analysing this issue, the nature of mortgage distress, how the Department of Finance and your department can work together to address this issue in the coming months and coming years to keep people in their homes? Because if you have lost your job, and if you don't necessarily feel that you're going to have an opportunity to return to employment in the short term, and if your bank is sending you letters, as they do, or making phone calls, as they do, or sticking on interest rates, as they do, because that's what they do, do we have a response for that as a people? Do we have a response to that as a parliament? Because I feel strongly, and I know it's a cliche and it feels almost like a political point-scoring exercise, but when they needed us, the state stepped in. I'm talking about the banks. The state stepped in and did not let them fail. And now the people need us, and the banks are not their friend. And I want to know, Minister, if you haven't or aren't having those conversations between your department and the Department of Finance, could you start having those conversations so that we are not waiting for an opportunity, waiting for the time when this comes tumbling down the road as a major issue in households across the country. I want to ask about homeless services, because I understand that those on the front line dealing with very, very vulnerable people in our homeless services, many of whom are, again, in conditions that many people in this House wouldn't sleep under, and a pandemic exposes again the nature of the limitations of their living circumstances, that the PPE that they require to operate, that they're required to use PPE, but it hasn't been made available to them, and are you having conversations with the HSE and Department of Health about that? I'm interested in your comment about council funding, that if any of us have a council that we deal with that is saying that they can't fund something because they don't have the resources, that you want to know that. I appreciate those comments, and I'm quite sure you'll be getting a lot of correspondence in relation to that. You raised the issue, and you referred to the issue about UL, and that's fair enough. You've raised again the issue and responded to the issue about direct provision, and that's fair enough as well. I want to ask the last question, though, about strategic housing development and your view of that. And I noted your comment about, objections, etc. Issues that people have with the Strategic Housing Development Act is that it totally overrode the democratically constructed, democratically constituted development plan of the local authority, voted in by councillors. And that it went straight to An Bord Pleanála. An Bord Pleanála does not have to adhere to that development plan, and therefore your department, through this Act, has afforded developers the rule book. They own it, it's theirs, and they can kind of do what they like with it. And in my part of the world, I'm dealing with a fire station who tells me that they have no capacity to deal with any fire above the sixth floor in an apartment block. And yet, An Bord Pleanála are handing planning permissions for major scale development across the north side of Dublin and across the state. What we all want, Minister, I think you will agree with me, are communities. And we want housing as a public good, in that it helps people to grow. And it helps communities to grow, and it helps people to grow together. But when you have somebody with a profit motive running the show, well, then that's going to have a major influence on where policy goes. So on those issues, Minister, I know I've only afforded you 3 minutes to respond, but I would appreciate your comments.
Thank you, Deputy Minister.
Thank you, Deputy, for those questions. So just in relation to the quality of emergency accommodation, we did bring in a new quality standards framework last summer that was done with the NGOs and the local authorities, that was rolled out across Dublin and is now to become the national standard. What we've seen in this crisis is, because we've decongregated heavily congregated settings, the outcomes for individuals in those new settings is just so far superior to what was there before. That was a big piece of the feedback that I was getting yesterday in my latest engagement with the NGOs. People are more settled, they are healthier, they are happier, they are engaging with treatment, engaging with different resources. It's better outcomes. So what we're trying to do as a piece of work is, what's it going to cost to continue in that vein? And then where do we source the accommodation from? Because not all of it is from the short-term letting sector. Some of it's from hotels as well. And hotels, we hope, in Dublin will come back into use at some point in the future. So we need to make sure we have plans in place now to prepare for that. In relation to rent freeze is made possible because of the emergency that we're in. There are real constitutional constraints to doing a rent freeze. There are also policy considerations that I think are worth taking into account, which I've made the arguments many times before. But we were, thankfully, in this emergency, able to put in place a rent freeze. And as I said, it can be extended by ministerial order if necessary. In relation to banking, so yes, I've spoken with the Minister of Finance about this issue very early on when it arose. I also engaged with the Banking and Payments Federation Ireland representative group. I didn't engage with the banks individually because the line minister is Minister Donoghue, but I did speak with him. I made sure that our Rebuilding Ireland home loan, that if we were going to be putting a holiday in place, that it wouldn't be at an extra cost to people, that interest wouldn't be charged over that period. So actually, people can engage with a mortgage holiday with their local authority lender and not be penalised for it, which I think is really, really important. I sat on the banking inquiry through 2014 and 2015 when they told us about the changed culture in the banks. That was at the same time the tracker scandal was happening. So I'll leave my comments on the banks there. In relation to PPE, there is sufficient PPE at the moment for NGOs and homeless services. One thing that has raised its head is, in the next few days, we're going to get guidance on whether or not face masks might be mandatory or advisable. That could then change the amount or quantity of PPE that we'll need into the future. I've already asked the DRHE to look at that and consider it. They already are, to see what that will mean. The PPE gets provided through the local health point of contact. And in relation to SHDs, as much as I'll say in this interaction, deputies, that we don't start a fight, they've been extended out to the end of 2021 and no further. And the next step was to tie use it or lose it planning permissions to SHDs. In fact, I wanted to tie it to all planning permissions. And that's something that has to be achieved by the next government, in my opinion. Thank you.